and welcome to The Greater Loop, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. My name is Marianne Maldonado, and today our guest is Jim Lindsay with the Council on Foreign Relations. And we're going to be talking about the greatest American foreign policy efforts that have been done in history and ones that didn't work quite so well. So welcome to the program, Jim.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's get right into it. You've studied American foreign policy for most of your career. What makes a good foreign policy? And maybe what do you think might have been one of the best ones in recent history?
Well, I think obviously when we're talking about the most successful or the least successful U.S. foreign policy decisions, we're talking about decisions either a lot to advance America's national interest or its values. And again, if you're looking at those issues that didn't work out, you're talking about ones that didn't advance or actually harmed American interests or values.
And what would you say has been maybe the best foreign policy, American foreign policy that has stood the test of time?
Well, I'll probably step back at that and say, I'm not going to give you my top. What I'm going to give you is the results of a survey I did with members of the Society for Historians of American Foreign Relations. This is the world's largest professional association of scholars devoted to the study of American foreign policy. I surveyed them. I asked them to tell me what they thought were the 10 best and 10 worst decisions in the history of U.S. foreign policy. I said, once you pick out your top 10, rank them for me, much like you would in a college football or basketball poll. And when the results were all tallied, the overwhelming conclusion of members of what's called CFR is that the number one foreign policy decision in the United States in terms of the best was the Marshall Plan, which came after the end of World War II. And that was the plan by which the United States helped put Western Europe back on its feet after the destruction of World War II. That decision solidified the Western alliance, helped push back Soviet expansion, and stabilized democracy in Western Europe.
And we've just celebrated our 250th anniversary. Maybe what was at the bottom of the list?
Well, the decision that topped the list of the worst decisions was the U.S. invasion of Iraq. And I think what you see there is people's conclusion that the United States went to war on the wrong pretenses, got involved in a bloody occupation, and ended up squandering a lot of blood and treasure for little positive benefit for America's national interests or values.
Mm-hmm. I've been fascinated by this. Do you think policy failures are from us doing too much or maybe from us not doing enough?
It can actually be both. I mean, I think one of the interesting things when you look at the list of this survey on the worst list, some of the decisions that made the top 10 worst decisions were, in fact, Marianne, examples of the United States not doing enough. And I think of the decision that came in number 8 in the list, which was the refusal to admit Jewish refugees into the United States in the years running up to World War II. Here was a case in which it was obvious to the American public broadly, and certainly to its political leaders, what was happening in Europe, the sort of oppression that Jews were facing in Germany, in places that Germany occupied, yet the United States still refused to take in large numbers of Jewish refugees.
And I'm sure that many of these foreign policies have had unintended consequences. Is there one that rises to the top?
Well, in terms of sort of unintended consequences, I think one of them, if you were sort of looking at American history, was the Mexican-American War, which basically led to a great deal of division in the United States over the propriety of the war and over the constitutionality of the war. It's one of the things that helped bring Abraham Lincoln to the public forefront because he challenged the administration of the time on the question of whether the war had begun in a constitutional way.
Is foreign policy success based on maybe the quality of the decision, or is it more about the timing and maybe a little luck?
Well, I think luck figures into foreign policy decisions just as it does into everything else in life. And I think, however, though, that when you look at the issues that sort of top the list, at least as historians saw it, I think you're seeing things in which a lot of forethought went into what was being done. Whether we're talking about the Marshall Plan or think of some of the other decisions that came about that time, the creation of the Bretton Woods system, the creation of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These were all things that a lot of people spent a lot of time thinking through. And I think one of the clear things that emerges is that in these decisions, policymakers began with a clear sense of what it was they were trying to accomplish. One of the famous things that came out of the Marshall Plan was after Harry Truman tasked then Secretary of State George Marshall to come up with a plan to solidify a pretty shaky Europe. Marshall has a meeting. He talks to his chief staff who's going to run this project, a guy named George Kennan. George Kennan asks Marshall for advice, and Kennan's answer is avoid trivia. And I think that's probably the hallmark of really good foreign policy decision-making when you are focused on big picture questions and you map out a clear way to get there.
In your research, if you were to go back and sit in the situation room for some of these decisions, is there one policy decision that maybe you'd have liked to have been in the room for and weighed in on?
Well, I would have loved to have been in on all of these decisions because they all involve important moments in American foreign policy. I think one of the clear things that comes through when you look at events that end up on the worst list is that there are often decisions in which the United States decides to use military force, probably without really thinking through the consequences and the level of commitment, and then sticking with that choice, in essence, doubling down on a failed policy. We saw that particularly in the case of the Vietnam War, where the United States went to war with the best of intentions, though quite clearly for President Lyndon Johnson, he was skeptical about how successful any U.S. military operation in Vietnam was going to be. Nonetheless, he stuck with this policy and at each moment decided to increase America's commitment rather than to draw back. And I think, again, looking at sort of the worst decisions, that is a common theme. Force is used without really thinking through the purpose of it, its likelihood of success, maybe exaggerating what the United States can accomplish with its military might, and then sticking by that policy long by its sell-by date.
And I think Americans often debate on whether we should lead globally or maybe focus our attentions at home. Looking at history, what does the evidence tell us from a policy perspective?
Well, I think the answer there is it depends upon what era of U.S. history you're talking about. I mean, for the first 50 years of its existence, the United States was a weak, powerless country that spent a lot of time avoiding or trying to avoid being caught up in the wars that were going on in Europe. And at some points we succeeded. At other points, like with the War of 1812, we sought a war and it didn't go terribly well for us. I think, we tend to forget about the War of 1812, or if we do recall that, we remember the Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson famously defeated a much larger force of British troops. But that great victory, and it was the one big land victory for U.S. forces during that war, came 2 weeks after the peace treaty ending the war had been signed. So it's a little bit after the fact. I think as you come to the modern era, let's say World War II and later on, it's clear that the United States is a big, powerful country, and it needs to act on that basis because its interests are affected by things around the world. The real interesting part of American history is that sort of 3 decades before World War II, where America had the capability to be actively involved in the world. In some places it was, think Latin America, but in other places, particularly Europe, it wasn't. And perhaps in retrospect, we might have charted a different course if we had realized what our power was capable of doing earlier than we did.
And many Americans haven't lived through the Cold War. We haven't lived through 9/11. Tell us a little bit about the impetus for this report and why now?
Well, the impetus for the report was we were having a conversation and I was asked by someone what I regarded to be the top decisions in the history of the United States in foreign policy. And I said, well, I hadn't seen anybody do any work trying to do that. It was said to me, would you be interested in doing it? And I said, okay. And obviously the way to do this is to go out and ask people who spend their professional lives thinking about these issues. We went to historians and said, you tell us. And we presented them in this survey with 120 major decisions over the course of U.S. history. That is from the signing of the Declaration of Independence back in 1776 all the way up through 2020. And we asked them again to pick and to rank. And that's sort of where we came away. And it's sort of, again, the interesting thing is that, for I think historians, there are really sort of critical errors where big decisions, where big mistakes are made. Obviously at the beginning of the foundation of the United States, you have major decisions about avoiding war with Britain, about the Louisiana Purchase, decisions that echo throughout the rest of U.S. history. And, similarly, when you sort of look at the worst decisions, there are times in which, the United States clearly choices it made did not work the way people at the time hoped. Think of the Senate rejection of the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, which led to this sort of intensifying desire to sort of stay away from another war in Europe, which in an odd way helped to increase the chances that the United States went to war. And overall, in sort of doing this survey, one of the reasons we did it is we're trying to both educate Americans about their history, the choices that the United States has made over the time, for good or for ill, but also to get people to sort of see parallels in history. Now, history doesn't rhyme, but it certainly echoes. The challenges we face today, in many ways, aren't that different than the challenges faced by prior generations, whether we're talking about the founding generation, we're talking about the era of McKinley and Theodore Roosevelt, or Roosevelt and Truman. The reality is the United States is continually navigating tough foreign policy challenges. And the challenge for decision makers is to choose wisely. And in some cases, they have done so quite brilliantly and remade the world. At other junctures, of course, the United States has chosen wrongly, and we are suffering or continue to suffer from the consequences of those decisions.
And where can our audience find more about this amazing study?
Well, if you go to CFR.org and query about best, worst foreign policy decisions, we have a great website that focuses on the top 10 best and the top 10 worst decisions with sort of histories of each of them. And within another month or so, we're going to expand that up to the top 25 best and the top 25 worst decisions. So it's a really robust webpage with lots of information, lots of links to how to learn more, whether it's documentaries, articles, podcasts, timelines, and websites. So we're really proud of the work.
Well, thank you, Jim. And I encourage our audience to go to CFR.org, check this out, as well as like our podcast and come back often. Thank you, Jim, for joining us. It's been our pleasure.
Thank you, Marianne. Be well.